Dr. Cory Hutcheson, welcome to Head on Fire.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back. I'm using my
Oh,
NPR. This is my NPR voice.
you have an excellent NPR voice. I have been jealous of your voice for 13
Oh,
years.
oh, honey, if I could sing like you, that would be we'd just be a double threat. It'd be great. I'd love it. So
you say it's good to be back. You've not been on Head on Fire.
oh, that's true.
You
That's
have
true.
not. I know, it's crazy.
It's good to
So
be
for
here.
folks who don't know you and maybe
Mhm.
don't know our history, maybe this is the first time they're ever seeing us collaborate. Tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Well, I rescued you when your plane crashed in the Andes, and we dragged your frozen body 300 miles. No, just kidding. No.
He's very strong. It was very much
Like an ox.
a Melissa McCarthy in that movie with her and Jason Bateman, where she carries him through the forest. Is
No,
that?
I've seen your post workout pictures. If anything, you'd be dragging me over the mountains. So, but no. So you and I go way back. We've been podcasters on the scene talking about different topics having to do with spirituality, folklore, history, sociology, psychology, all kinds of things. Over a decade now. That's
13
surprising.
years for me. It's
Yeah.
when you were. Did you all start spring of 2010?
We started January 2010.
January 2010. I beat you by like 3 months, 4 months.
Yes, you were right
September
there,
2009.
Yes. Yeah. So we basically entered the scene almost at the same time, with a small handful of other podcasters. I say a small handful. It felt at the time like a flood.
2009 to 2011 was a really fun time to be a podcaster, because I just don't think people these days I will never forget. When was the first time that you looked around at the world around you and realized that something about podcasting had changed, but it hadn't changed for you? For me, it was the day that I was watching TV and there was a commercial that came on, and it was like a pharmaceutical commercial. And the woman was like, as a busy podcast editor, I don't have time, and I need to be able to make sure that my joints don't turn to jello. So that's why I take this. And I was like, we're not only a demographic. First of all, y'all have editors?
Right.
Wait, what? Sorry, what happened? Y'all have people, and they have enough money to like that be their full-time job. What? Yeah. We were before that.
No, we were well before that. There's some time in like the 2015 to 2019 period where definitely there was a shift, and all of a sudden podcasting was like when we told people we were podcasters, in 2010, 2011,
you were a nerd in your basement.
Right. It was sort of like, oh, what an interesting hobby.
Yeah.
But now the assumption is if you say you're a podcaster, they're like, oh, that's
you're
great.
rich.
That's your full-time job, right? Yeah. And then there's people who podcast, they'll call it podcasting, but it's what we would have called vlogging.
I know.
And it's a little weird, right?
Yes.
Because we had
I'm like, wait, we were the OGs. Why have all these terms left us? Like, what? No.
It's how it works. It evolves, right? And it's fine. There's some really wonderful folks who do some really great video podcasts, I guess is kind of the right terminology at this point. But so it's just, yeah.
So you are the co-host, along with Lane, of a podcast called New World Witchery, a search for North American folk magic, which has since January of 2010 long been one of my very favorite things to ever exist.
Thank you.
And I love it. You actually are like a real live folklorist, though.
Yes. So that's my real thing. Yeah.
This is a really fun time of year to talk about folklore, because I don't feel like we talk about it throughout the year more than we talk about it right now. Like the December to January is a whole lot of folklore thrown at people. Halloween, we get some.
I was going to say,
I feel like we get a lot of it between December 1st and mid-January.
Yes. Yeah, no, if you're talking about anything having to do with the supernatural or superstition, really starting from October 1st, running all the way into mid-January, it's just like I may as well be a CPA, and it's early April, because it's just constant stuff. I did a lecture it was not a lecture, it was called Profs and Pints, where it was in a pub, had 75 some odd people, having drinks and stuff like that. And I'm sitting there giving, a sort of stand-up comedy / lecture presentation on all of the different kind of weird Christmas monsters that exist at this time of year. And so it's one of those things that people really glom onto at this point in the calendar, which makes sense. This
Gryla uses a lot of floss, am I right? I can just imagine like what that stand-up is like.
Yeah, no, I'm not nearly funny enough to be a real stand-up or anything like that, but I can occasionally get a zinger in when I'm talking about, Krampus in his tongue or stuffing you in his sack, as is the way. But the thing with this time of year is that this was obviously the time of year when people were finishing up a lot of the agricultural tasks and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they would be going inside. The nights were long and dark. You sat around and you told stories and things like that. So this is really the time of year when you have a lot of that folklore sort of surging up. It makes a lot of sense that we would still be doing that.
In a very real way. I mean, if you don't fully understand it, or it's a bit of an uncertainty out in the world, if you notice that the days are getting shorter and the nights are getting longer, and resources are getting more scant, it's an appropriately fearful time of year.
It is, right. No, the longer nights definitely, I think, contribute to that. Although whenever people sort of talk about these mythical cycles and sort of like bringing back the sun at the solstice and stuff, I'm like, ancient peoples were a lot smarter than people give them credit for.
Yes.
Like they knew very well what was happening. This wasn't like, three priests in the entire community knew the real things that were happening and everybody else was like completely duped. Everybody knew. Everybody was very aware of kind of what's going on. The myth just helps you talk about it. So
sure.
Yeah.
I think that you bring up a very good point, that when we talk about folklore, we tend to think of people as being very, very stupid. And folklore was the way that these simple people were able to explain the world around them. And while there is a nugget of truth that we use myth and folklore and tales and stuff to explain why things are the way they are, why is the crow black, why is why did the oceans rise at one point, yada yada yada. There's lots of myths that are used to explain why things happen. Lots of people have creation myths, but it's not because people were just dumb.
No, people are remarkably smart.
Or at least not in the time period that you're thinking.
Right. Like, I mean, if you're projecting this all the way back to kind of like the Stone Age,
right?
People sitting around.
Maybe somebody seeing fire for the first time might be like, "Hey, what's that?"
That's pretty remarkable. But even then, I still think there's a depth to human intelligence that it's very easy for us to elide over it and talk about, like, sort of think of ourselves as sort of the evolution, the picture of, the thing coming out of the ocean all the way up to the sort of upright walking human, and sort of thinking of ourselves as the pinnacle of that. And it's like, no, there have been really remarkable thinkers and doers and makers throughout human history. And it's just a matter of, we have a different set of resources and paradigms now, but we still generate folklore. Like, we're still generating folklore all the time. So it's not like we're smarter. We just do things differently than other people do. And we have been able to sort of advance ourselves in some really interesting ways due to things like science and rationality, rational thinking in certain ways too.
Oh, that crazy stuff.
Yes. But in some ways, I mean, I think there's in doing that, I think there were wonderful things that happened. We have people who can live to 80, 90, 100 years now, right? We can cure diseases, and you can get vaccinations that will prevent you from getting ill. At the same time, when you try to explain things like that, there can be something where you pull back from the wonder of it, and I think that's something that's a hard balance to strike. And folklore helps us add a little bit of wonder to kind of the world around us in some lovely ways.
So that's a question that I wanted to ask you. I know that we're going to talk about some wintertime monsters and some fun stuff, but I do kind of want to ask you just about the field of folklore and what it can mean to us today. Like, what do you think? Like, what are your students, whenever you're giving a lecture, like what do you think that they are seeking from you, other than just kind of fun stories?
I mean, so that's the joke, is that when you tell somebody you're a folklorist, the first thing they'll ask you is, "Oh, tell me a story," right? And folklorists, academic folklorists in particular, are really terrible storytellers sometimes. We're long-winded and we want to explain things in detail, and that's not how you tell a good story. So that's a trap that we can fall into. Students do want those stories. They want to know the spooky stories. And a lot of people enter into folklore thinking of it as myth busting, which is not. It's not, there are times that that's what we do. And there's been some arguments recently that we should be doing more of that because of things like anti-vaccination, propaganda and things like that, where we as folklore should step in and say, like, no, we can trace the origin of some of the stuff that you're saying very, very clearly, and point to the fact that this is a human created story that's not actually based on anything factual. So there's been some pushback on that, but really for the past 40 to 50 years, it's not been an emphasis on myth busting so much as being able to kind of explain how folklore helps people communicate with each other, and helps us give meaning to our lives and give meaning to the things that we do, because we do weird things as human beings. We're very, very weird. I mean, we have a Netflix show called How to Build a Sex Room right now. There's like, yeah, I know, like there's all kinds of like crazy stuff that's out there. And I'm not here to yuck anybody's yum. Anybody, if you're into whatever you're into, that's
I don't know
fine.
what you're talking about, Cory. This room is just a normal room
With a bunch of masks on the
with
walls.
a bunch of masks. Okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't everybody have that room with all the masks
Exactly.
on the walls?
Yes. But that's the thing. It's like we love the stuff. We love the kind of odd creative stuff that we can do, the way that we can spill our creativity out into the world and make things that we haven't seen before. We can sort of create chimeric entities and things like that for ourselves, that allow us to play with possibilities and play with the what ifs of the world. And sometimes in doing that, we make some amazing leaps in either imagination or amazing leaps in reasoning or thought. We can conduct really interesting thought experiments through that. Sometimes we use these things to reinforce education, or even societal norms or morals and things like that. And so in some ways, folklore can be both positive and negative when it does that. So that's, when I'm talking to my students, I try to get them to see that folklore isn't just the stories. It's the iceberg, right? We've seen these iceberg memes and things like that, where, we see folklore and we think stories and myths and, old wives' tales that we can bust. But then it goes so much deeper down to things like just, what do you call this bottle of fizzy drink, right? And where you are, what do you call it?
Oh, are you talking about like, is it pop? Is it soda? I'm weird. I say soda. I feel like that's weird.
Yeah, some people call it pop, some people call it soda, some people call it cold drink, some people call it
of course,
soda
in
pop.
Texas,
Coke.
it was Coke.
It's always Coke,
Yeah.
right?
And I remember my aunt was really disappointed in me, and my uncle's going to listen to this. And my aunt was really disappointed in me because when I went to go visit and we were at a convenience store, I said that I'll get the drinks because we were going on a mini little day trip. And I went into the convenience store to get the road snacks. And she said, I'll have a Diet Coke. And I came back with a Diet Coke. And that was the wrong thing. She looked at me, she said, I meant Diet Pepsi. Why did you get me this? And I was like, she asked for a Diet Coke. She's like, oh, you've been in Chicago too long.
Yeah.
You've been in Chicago too long. So yeah, I've lost that. But yeah, yes. I do distinctly remember a period when everything was Coke.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Do you want a Coke? What kind do you have?
Yeah. And that's all part of the folk speech, right? That's the way we identify things. And it identifies you, this as a sociologist, in the in-group out-group dynamic, right? Where she was able to then say, you've been in Chicago too long. You're no longer entirely one of us, right? Like we have to re-indoctrinate you somehow. We have to bring you back in so that you can use the right term, right? Or it becomes a way that she can sort of make fun of you and poke fun of you and use the humor of it to sort of reintegrate you into the group and things. So there's a whole complex of things that happen with folklore. And the stories are just one of those.
I've always thought of science fiction, mythology, folklore, folk tales, the fictional stories that we tell can help us tell ourselves greater truths about ourselves than sometimes nonfiction, than sometimes going back and just looking at history. I feel like sometimes it's easier, or there are some really nuanced kinds of messages, kinds of truths that it takes a fictional setting to kind of make your brain click. Like I think sometimes, like, today's an appropriate day to talk about it, like Hogfather by Terry Pratchett. There is just a way that Death talks to Susan about the nature of belief
Mhm.
that I had never gotten before until I had read that story, and it clicked for me in a way. I know that you and I share a love for like the films of Hayao Miyazaki and
Mhm.
some Neil Gaiman and some other creators that we just really love, who just have a way of telling a story that tells a greater truth about ourselves, a greater truth about humanity in a way that you just can't always get with straight
Yeah.
up nonfiction and a straight up just kind of informative presentation of fact. And
Mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
No. Finish your thought, because
No. I
it's
just,
kind of.
I think, I mean, do you think that that's what folklore, folk tales help us do? Is that true in the way that you understand it as well? Are these ways of us kind of like telling our story in a way that kind of helps other people understand, other than just saying, okay, well, on this day this happened and this is what we did about it, and on this day this happened and this is what we did about it?
There's definitely, so that's like the teleological myths, right? Where you're
Mm-hmm.
explaining like, why is the river the way it is? Well, there's a nymph that lives in this river, and this is how she acts, right? This is what we understand from her story. She cried herself into this stream, and so if you listen carefully, you can always hear her crying. And then we sort of explain like, this is a place of sorrow. Well, maybe somebody drowned there. We don't know. There's lots of stuff that can get tied up into that. But I think what's really interesting about that, you mentioned Neil Gaiman in there. He's got this amazing poem called Instructions, which I don't know if you've read this poem. It's
Of
it's so
course
great. It's
I
such a great,
have.
so great.
Yes.
And what
It's
I
so
love about
vague and
that,
so weird, and I love it. I love it so much because it's the hero's journey. I love it.
right? But the thing about it is, if you read it, even if you don't know every story he's referencing, and he's potentially referencing a lot of
Ev
stories,
yeah, every
you
story.
still you still understand it. Like, I think the whole thing starts off with like, touch the wooden gate in the wall and say please before you open the latch, then walk down the path. There's this whole like series of instructions that he's giving you for how you leave home and then how you return home, and all the things you're going to go through, right? um and I love that, because you can hear these instructions, and intuitively you get some of them that you don't necessarily know exactly what the reference is, but you understand them on a sort of deeper level. And that's something that I think folklore really does for us, is it gives us this, it's almost like being in a soup, right? Like, we're all in this soup of folklore. And even though we may be, individual carrots or potatoes or whatever in the soup, we have this broth binding us, and so much of that is it's culture, right? And folklore gives us a language for understanding culture that is both engaging and metaphorical, and also instructive, and it gives us a sense of control over things, even when they oftentimes are very much out of our control as well. So folklore can do a lot, in terms of what it's doing for all of us collectively, and not just us individually.
You brought up a really good point earlier that people 100 years ago, 500 years ago, even 1,000 years ago are not these like simple-minded dolts
Hmm.
that, took everything literally and thought that the reason
Hmm.
that water existed is because of blah, 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 because a
Hmm.
frost giant melted and there we go. Um, so I I want to understand, when we go back and read these stories and we read how these are stories of culture and these are the stories that certain cultures and societies told about themselves to one another to teach one another certain kinds of things. How literally do you think that people took them, and how literally should we think of them today?
It's a really good question.
Thank you. I've been doing this since 2009. Thank you so much.
Indeed,
Appreciate
yes, it shows.
it.
Um, I mean, you can look at Greek myths. Greeks, I mean, in Greeks, the Greek myths are a pretty accessible thing for a lot of people, just because if you're in
Mhm.
Western culture, they're
We all
like
learned them.
instructions.
Yeah.
They're around you, whether you imbibe them through the Percy Jackson series, or whether you get them through the Edith Hamilton mythology book, or Bullfinches, or just sort of absorbing them by proxy. It's very similar to how we get a lot of sort of biblical lore, sort of
It's
in
just out
soup,
there.
right?
You can't miss it. Yeah.
So you wind up familiar with at least concepts, even if you don't know
Mhm.
everything about it. But Greek myth is really fascinating, and I bring up this example pretty frequently. But the Greeks were fine with stories being different. They didn't need uniformity among stories. They weren't investing them with absolute truth. So, for example, there's a story about Hercules, who he's attacked by some thieves on the road, right? And these thieves jump out of the bushes and they come after him. And he's, I think he's just slain the mean lion or something like that. And of course, this was a bad day on their part. They made a mistake, right? They attacked the strongest dude in the world. Well, so he soundly trounces them, ties them up. He's carrying them on a pole over his shoulder to go into the nearest city where they can, be arrested, stand trial for whatever it is. And in one version of the story, they happen to be kind of hanging down over his shoulder and, hanging low enough that they can kind of see up the back of his tunic. And Heracles is a hirsute fellow, right? He's a daddy bear in a lot of ways, right? He's got that shaggy backside. And so they start making fun of him for it. And in one version of the story, he hears them doing this and he starts laughing along with them. This is really funny. I think there's a version where he even lets them go because they made him laugh, right? Or you can have the version of the story where they start making fun of him and they're laughing and everything, and he immediately slaughters them for making fun of him. Both versions exist within Greek society. Both versions circulate and fulfill different purposes. In some versions, it's this: you don't laugh at the hero, right? In some version, it's the hero can laugh along with people who make fun of him, right? You can have both versions of a story circulating in society, or many versions of a story circulating in society. It's when you start to invest them with this idea of a sort of absolute, unassailable truth that they become very problematic, where you say, well, we want to literally explain the origin of humanity as, and I may get in trouble for this, I don't know, literally explain the origin of humanity as, somebody made out of clay, and then another person being made out of clay plus a bone that was pulled out of the first clay dude. And then they are supposed to eat fruit, but not one fruit, but then they eat that fruit, and then that fruit makes them no longer welcome in the fruit place, and so they have to leave the fruit place, right? And
are eggs cheap where you are? Because you have a lot of eggshells in that little tiny room of yours that you're currently walking on. I appreciate it. It's good.
Right. Well, I mean, but that's not the only one. I mean, there's also literalism in, you could have literalism in stories, about, again, going back to the Greeks, right? Literally, like, why do we have troubles? Well, a young woman opened a box, right? If we invested the story of Pandora with absolutism, the the level of sort of misogyny that easily
gracious, yeah.
And I'm not saying
there are a lot of stories in a lot of cultures that it's just like, oh, why is everything terrible? Because of women.
Right.
Because of women.
And it's because of this sort of literalism, as opposed to sort of taking it as that, like, this is the metaphor about listening to what a higher power is telling you to do, or why we don't have perfection in the world. Well, because we as humans, we don't like perfection. We get tired of it. We do stupid things and mess it up. So.
It's sort of a natural line, at least for me, to be able to draw from. Since we're talking about myth, I always think of comic book superheroes as the modern myths. They're the modern gods, or the modern mythos, and especially since the MCU and now a little bit the DCEU has really become the zeitgeist. The us weird geeks are now apparently the overculture, which is weird. But there's a lot of people that are very, very, very precious about comic book canon and about the things that happen in the comic book, and that you can't deviate from that. But those same people will tell you, well, these are the modern myths, and these are our modern gods, and these are, these graphic novels, this modern graphic literature should be respected, and yada, yada. And I'm like, okay, well, if they are myths, you also have to realize, like, there is no canon to mythology. There is no singular canon to mythology. What did the great Stan Lee tell us? Who would win in a fight between Superman and Wonder Woman, Batman and the Joker, or whoever the writer wants to win, whatever tells the best story in that moment. And I think that kind of echoes what you're saying. What tells the best story between Heracles and the guys on his back? I don't know. What's the best story in that moment? What does the person that you're telling the story to need to hear in that moment? And maybe what's the story that you need to tell in that moment? Which version of it serves your purpose and serves their purpose, and creates that line between the two of you?
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and you're tapping into something there that folklorist Richard Bauman talked about, which is the sort of the audience teller relationship,
right?
And as the teller will evolve the story very much depending on the audience, and it has to, because if you try to tell the same story verbatim every time, you're going to lose audience members. You're going to lose your ability to connect with people on a human level, because it's just one story over and over again. And even stories that do get locked down, movies and things like that, right? So they're, people are big fans of like The Princess Bride, right? Or they're big fans of the Goonies or something like that, right? People, I know, I'm not going to get. I'm already on enough eggshells, so I'm not going to say that I'm not a fan of the Goonies. It's just not my favorite film.
Oh no, I'm not a fan. I was hiding. I neither like The Princess Bride nor The Goonies.
And that's totally fine. But people bring their own stuff to those, right? Like they will bring the specific quotes that they want to elevate from the story.
Oh,
They
well,
will
sure.
remember
Yeah,
characters
yeah.
in certain ways.
Yeah.
So, even when it's a locked down story, you're going to tell the story you want to tell. The comic book thing is so interesting because, and you're so deep into the comic lore, expanded into the actual comics. A lot of people who are coming at it from just the films, it's perfectly valid to come at it from just the films, and enjoy the stuff just from the films. But you're not going to be able to speak to the same lore that somebody who's in the comic books speaks to. And so you're going to have to negotiate those differences when
And there's just a negotiation of the
stories.
fact that in both the Marvel universe, the DC universe, they've just been telling these stories for so long. I mean, these are living documents.
Yes.
These are living stories, and new writers continue to take hold of characters and decide to tell it in a new way.
Yes. And I should say that's a big thing with folklore.
Exactly.
When you're talking about comic books and when you're talking about movies and things like that, there's an author. You have an author. You can go back and say, this is what Stan Lee said, right? Or this is what Jack Kirby said. But with folklore, you can't. Usually, even if you can trace something back to a single author where it sort of originated, the whole point of it being folklore is that it gets taken away from that author and disseminated among a population or a group who then make it their own. And there's no single origin, single source. So the way somebody talks about comic books may not agree with what Jack Kirby said, may not agree with what Stan Lee said, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong necessarily. It just means that it's their folk interpretation of these characters. Now, that may not jive with everyone's folk interpretation of those characters, but it is.
I want to ask because
to the folk group. So,
for some people, this might be a learning experience. I know it was for me a few years ago, because I was under the impression, and I was under the very incorrect impression, that the difference between like a bit of folklore or a folktale and a myth was basically time and the amount of people that believe in it. That was wrong. So I would love for you to give some quick and dirty definitions of like, what is folklore, what's a folktale, and what's a myth, and what defines them, etc. Like, I don't know. So, I thought you like graduated from one to the other.
Well, you can absolutely have a folktale that does graduate to the level of myth. Myths are invested with sacred truth. They have to have significance to the culture that explains something about the culture, or that that holds a sort of spiritual identity for the group, even if it's not believed literally. It has to be believed at the level of this metaphor explains something about us, right? This is telling us something about us collectively, whereas a folktale isn't necessarily told that way. It can reinforce moral lessons, it can reinforce cultural identity points, but it's not telling something about the entire culture collectively as a whole. It's not about where we come from, who we are, or where we're going at the sort of big picture level. So a myth usually does that. And if you think about, a lot of the sort of, you think about the Yoruban myths, right? They're going to be talking about the sort of these specific entities that sort of emanate from a single source entity, right? That then sort of explain how we have, hot and cold, characteristics of life. So like, why are some things fiery and hot? Why are some things wet and cold? And how does all this kind of work together? Why is the ocean one thing and the river another thing? Well, let's get into kind of the big picture of that, because these are very important to how we survive in the world. Whereas a folktale, you might still have.
I just want to say just another connection with mythology, with comic books. In the last few years, there was a Black character introduced into the X-Men universe that actually stems from that exact myth of why something is hot and why something is cold. And her power is like half of her body is hot and half of her body is cold. And anyways, it's really cool. Her name is cool. Oye. I think I'll have to look that up. It's great. I love her. I'll send it to you.
No, that's fine. I mean, that also reminds me of My Hero Academia with Todoroki, but that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, if we're nerds about one thing, we're going to be nerds about a lot of things.
Yes.
So, there you go. But anyway, so the myths are telling these big picture, like the cosmological questions, right? The ones that really give us senses of purpose and identity. Folktales are going to tell us more about, how do we live day to day, right? How do we live our day-to-day lives? What is sort of the everyday thing? This is why you have the Brer Rabbit stories, right? Well, they want you to understand that there are situations that you're going to get into a scrape, and you need to be smart enough to get out of that, right? You need to personally be clever enough when you're trapped to figure out how to get out of that. And it's very important. Obviously, the Brer Rabbit stories are told. They're derived from a lot of kind of West African stories about Anansi and some of the other characters from West African folklore. But they come over to the United States, and they become the sort of central African American, Southeastern African American stories that are being circulated. And the Brer Rabbit stories are there to say, like, look, sometimes you're going to get blamed for stuff that is not your fault, or you're going to be doing stuff because you're in a terrible situation. For example, enslavement, and you don't have control. The only thing you can control is how smart you are in that situation to overcome it. And so that becomes very, very important as a part of the narrative. Folktales, folktales are there to sort of give us that sort of entertainment value, while also usually reinforcing something about our culture, telling us something about how we live in the day-to-day world. Legends are interesting because they're told as true. So there's always, even if they're wild, even if they're totally out there, they're told as though they have a core grain of truth around which they are built.
Is that like Paul Bunyan? Is Paul Bunyan a legend, or is that a folktale?
Paul Bunyan is an advertising construct.
Okay, listen. Okay, fine. Shut up.
That's okay. No, this is the whole thing.
What about Tony the Tiger, Cory? What about Tony the Tiger?
With his milk-cooled supercomputer. Have you seen this video?
No.
He did a live stream with a couple of YouTubers where, like, he was gaming with them, and he had
I saw that, but I only saw that because it got on Twitter, and it was like, oh no, apparently it turned south real fast.
It was not great.
Yeah, I think the furries found it or something, and I was like, oh no, furries need to leave the cereal mascots alone, please.
Yeah. But no, yeah. So Paul Bunyan, he is now folklore in that he's sort of been pulled from where he originally came from, which was this sort of.
Is King Arthur a legend?
I would say yes. I would say
okay.
I would say that's a really good example of a legend.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really good at this.
Only took you 3 tries. That was great. No, because we want to say that there is some core truth to that, whether we situate that as there was a quote unquote Celtic chieftain.
I was gonna say I'll say it. It's sort of like Jesus, in that people keep trying to find the historical figure, like the actual bones. Like people keep trying to find him.
Right. And the thing about him is there may be multiple ones.
Right.
Multiple people were
Signe Pike has a really cool historical fiction story, kind of about one possible historical basis for the myth, but she also recognized that she's like, there's also like half a dozen others from different cultures in Western Europe.
And Robin Hood, very similar, right? Like we can point to that and say, like, well, we think there was a person, we think there's this person that basically this is based on, but then
I'm sorry, you keep saying person told, I think you mean fox, right? Fox.
Why which fox are you talking about? I'm thinking Renard the Fox. Is that what you're thinking of?
No, I mean Robin Hood the Fox. Disney's Robin Hood, Cory.
Whatever. I thought you were
What childhood did you have?
No, the Fox. No, I love that movie. I love that movie. We can talk about Disney and folklore for a long time.
Well, I do want to ask about modern folklore and what does it take for a story that we tell each other now to reach the level of folklore versus just paranoid conspiracy?
That is a type of folklore. It is 100% conspiracy theories are a major field of study in folklore.
So like UFOs, ghosts, that kind of thing. Well, I guess ghosts, but UFOs and Sasquatch and Bigfoot, all that's all folklore.
That's all folklore, but I mean more to the point, those things are folklore that have they have people who are interested in them. There certainly is, we tell stories about them, cryptids and things like that. Very, very interesting to a lot of people. And for those who know, cryptids are cryptozoological creatures, which means they're creatures that we claim exist in some capacity or have existed in some capacity, but that there's no scientific evidence for it. It's a little bit of a slippery slope because for example, there was one called I always get this wrong. I think it's the Tokapi. It's either the Tokapi or the Tapaki. I'm sorry.
Togepi is a Pokemon.
Yeah, Okapi.
Okapi is
Okapi. Which was this kind of zebra horse progenitor, and was thought to be a mythical creature for a very long time by Europeans, who kept talking to these folks in this kind of remote mountainous African region, who kept saying, no, it's real, it really exists. And they're like, haha, what funny stories you have. And then they're like, we'll take you up the mountain, we'll show you where it is. And they're like, oh, we'll go on this mythic quest with you, of course. And they get up there and they're like, oh, there's a whole bunch of them grazing. Doesn't
the hippopotamus have a similar story? Isn't there a similar story about the hippo or the rhino? Or
the rhino people thought was the unicorn.
Yes,
so because its name basically means unicorn. So is this thing where people were like, oh, it's a unicorn, it's like a big powerful horse with a single horn on its head, and then you see a rhino. I'm sorry, that's not it.
I just for any children listening, you rhinoceroses are indeed magical, and Cory,
I wouldn't mess with them.
Cory is not saying that unicorns are not real.
I'm not. They actually just issued a permit for unicorns in Los Angeles County. So a young woman requested a permit if she can capture a unicorn. She wanted to make sure that she was abiding by local wildlife regulations. So she wrote a letter to this Los Angeles County Animal Control Center. And they sent her back a license and said, yes, if you get a unicorn, here's the proper feeding and care and information that you need for it. Make sure that you are giving it plenty of outdoor space and room to move around. You're feeding it a diet of watermelon at least once a week to keep it sweet. You want to polish its horn regularly. And they gave her the little license tag that she can put on her unicorn when she gets it. And they gave her a little stuffed unicorn so that she can keep that until she finds a real one.
So here's the thing. When you told me that story, when you started that story, the person in my head was 28. And as you continue to tell the story, she became 8. How old was this person? Was it 6, a child?
Yes,
okay,
she's 6.
Because I'm just imagining a disenchanted millennial like myself who would just apply to the city of Chicago and be like, hello, I'm going into the woods to find a unicorn. Can I please have one?
Yeah, I think they're going to tell you that. I think what they'll say is, no, there are no such things as unicorns unless you go up to Lake Forest, and they probably have one in the back there, just because that's where all the rich people live. So if anybody's got unicorns,
oh god, yeah, if there is a unicorn anywhere in here, it's an Elgin.
Yeah, it's being kept in someone's basement.
Fancy antique stores. Oh goodness gracious. Okay, so modern stories, news stories. How does a news story that we tell? So, okay, I'm writing a science fiction book. Is that folklore? Is that legend? Is that anything? Could it ever become that? Like, how does somebody take a little bit of story? Because I feel like we do that. I mean, in a way, there is structure to things going beyond itself. Think of fan fiction. Think of how a story is written and then fan fiction is told about it, and then that kind of creates its own rules and its own story and its own kind of mythos surrounding it, and then people adhere by those rules, and then there's fiction created of that and stories told of that and progenitors of stories and things like that. Like, what is that? What are we doing there?
So it's the process of folklorification, right? That's the process. So when you write something yourself, it is not folklore. It has authorship. It is at best a popular cultural production, right? So you've created something. You've created something that, if it finds a popular audience, reaches a few hundred to a few thousand people. They're fans of it. They enjoy it. At that point, it is still popular culture. Then somebody's going to take it. Somebody's going to take it away from you. And it's very important that this happens. They have to take it away from you, and they have to do something of their own to it. They have to twist it, change it, manipulate it in some way. And then they have to give it back to the culture in a way that has now divorced it from authorship, including their own authorship, and so that it can be circulated and shared.
Cory, I want to let you finish, but I have a very important question. I have a very important question for you. Is 50 Shades of Grey folklore?
No, because it still has authorship.
Okay. Because she took the vampires away. She took the sparkly vampires away and she made something new. And I'm really concerned. I'm really concerned that E.L. James is a folklorist.
Well, she would be a folklorist because she doesn't study folklore.
Okay, so I'm really concerned that she made that she did a thing.
She
I'm
did
scared.
do a thing. I'm sorry, she did a thing.
Oh,
But okay, more to the point. 50 Shades of Grey was folklore before she ever wrote it. Because Twilight was folklore before she ever wrote it because it's Beauty and the Beast. It's the story of Beauty and the Beast.
Which is the story of Cupid and Psyche. So yeah.
Story of Cupid and Psyche, right? So this is the thing. We're reinventing folklore all the time. We're just giving it new overlays. Now, when Stephanie Meyer writes her version of it, it is her version and it locks it down. And it takes it out of being folklore for a minute and makes it hers. Then when I was going to say M.R. James, that's not right.
E.L. James.
E.L. James, thank you. M.R. James, very different person.
Who is M.R. James?
I think M.R. James is like a sci-fi author.
Yeah. So no shade James. To M.R. James fans out there. Just never heard of you.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, so E.L. James takes it and she makes her own sort of creation, and it's not folklore while they have their name on it, but then people start writing fan fiction about it. And yes, those people do have names and identities, but importantly, a lot of times those are obscured, right? They're going to be screen names, screen identities. They can't make money off of it, right? You can't copyright it. And copyright and folklore are not friends, I should say. They can be amicable, acquaintances, but they are not close friends ever. And so when stuff starts circulating, you have to kind of strip it of that authorship so that it can circulate, and so people can tell their own stories and do their own thing with it. This gets into you probably remember the series Firefly, right? Yeah. Well, there was a whole thing where this, the fan community really loves Firefly. They really loved this. They tried to launch campaigns to get more seasons. They had, fan fiction, stuff like that. Well, then people started knitting the hat, the Jane Cobb hat that you find on Firefly, the sort of orange and brown and yellow hat that he wears, and selling them on Etsy. Okay. Now, that hat was created for that show, right? This isn't something that, that whoever the first person who knit that hat that was a fan, they didn't come up with it out of their own brain. This existed. It was created for the show. So when they started trying to sell it, Fox tried to sue them, started trying to sue all these kind of creators on Etsy who are creating all these kind of Jane Cobb hat things. And the fans were like, look, you're not doing anything with this. You canceled the show. You don't sell this merchandise. We're not competing with you in any way. We're just fans circulating the stuff among ourselves, kind of paying the cost of creating this stuff. And Fox pushed back, and there was a lot of fighting, and eventually they dropped the lawsuit because the fan pushback was so strong, right? And that's where the folklorification is happening, right? Where the community overwhelms the individual nature of the storytelling, or the individual nature of whatever the cultural production is.
Now that we've defined our terms, Dr. Cory Hutcheson, I want to ask you, because this is this magical, special holiday time of year. One, why do you think so much folklore, so many folk tales, so many stories persist in this time of year when they don't persist quite as heavily throughout the year?
I mean,
what about this time is so special?
Right. No, I mean, this kind of gets back to this idea of you're finishing up all of the major agricultural work that this goes back to kind of pre-industrialized society in so many ways. You finished up all the agricultural work for the year, and so you can come inside. You're going to be spending a lot more time inside because it's going to get cold. You're going to have to kind of subsist on less, but before you can get to the less, you actually have a period of time when you have a lot, right? You have a lot of stuff for a very brief period of time as winter sets in.
All that perishable stuff is just about to go bad on the shelf.
You got to get through it. You got to burn through all that stuff. And then the stuff that you've been able to dry and preserve and salt and smoke and all that, that's going to last you through until at least spring, early summer. But you have a period of deprivation you're going to set up for yourself somewhere in there too, which is why we have things like Lent, right? So you have a period somewhere in there where you're going to have some fasting, you're going to have some abstinence from indulgences. But before we get to that, you've got to, all that freshly killed meat. You've got all the freshly harvested fruit and grains and stuff like that. You got to get through that first. And so we have to have some stuff to do with that. The light is going away, which means it's a little more fearful of a time. We want to deal with that fear. And sometimes the healthiest way to confront fear is to just, go full force into it. Right. So we want to tell the scariest stories right now. While also offering hope, right? So we focus on sort of light returning as well. We have a lot of holidays based on the idea of light in darkness at this point in the year too. So all that's kind of coming together, and it makes this time of year a very good time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, for generating a lot of folklore during this kind of late fall to early winter period. And then once you've kind of got that going, once you hit the industrialized period, so really kind of the late 1700s into the early 1800s, when we start really industrializing rapidly, prior to that, we're dealing with all this as an agricultural cycle. Well, then you have the added layer of everybody who has moved from these farms and moved from these communities. Suddenly they're in cities and they're like, I really miss, having a break. I really miss having this downtime of the year. And so we get really nostalgic about stuff, and we start trying to relive a lot of it in this time period, the 1800s particularly. We get really nostalgic about like the good old fashioned Christmas and stuff like that.
There is
both of those things.
For some reason, when you think of Christmas, you think the women in the big skirts and the fur muffs and the ice skates.
Well,
and the...
that's its own construction from the 1800s, because Christmas was not that.
No, I know,
no,
but like that whimsical watercolor painting version of the late 1800s, and then we do something kind of similar with about the 1930s to the 1950s, that like mid-century modern period, the much brighter, much more colorful period where department stores took over and injected all of their characters, made up Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and we're like, here, you like this, right?
Yep.
Come shop at our store.
Yes.
We have very specific nostalgia for those two periods, which are fake. Both are fake.
Well, they really existed, but the stories we tell about them,
the stories that we tell about them, the visuals that we have of them, they weren't quite as fun.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, we shouldn't try to position this as like there's literally gaps in the timeline, people. You just have to.
No, there are. No, that's what I'm saying. No, that's what I'm saying. No, that's what I'm saying. No. Time started in 1986, actually.
No more of it. I hate it. Oh my gosh.
What's your, do you have a favorite wintertime beastie out there? There are a lot, and this time of year people talk about them. Everybody knows the Santa, which thank you, Coca-Cola, for that.
Well, really thank you, Washington Irving, Clement Clark Moore / Henry Livingston. Like that's where Santa comes from for us. People say it's the Coca-Cola thing. Coca-Cola has something to do with how we envision it in the 20th century, but Santa was not entirely a creation of Washington Irving, but really heavily influenced by Washington Irving and this poem that comes out in the 1820s. So those two things.
The visit from Saint Nick, right?
Visit from Saint Nicholas, which
is what the artist in the Coca-Cola marketing department used specifically to create the visuals.
Well, so he used Thomas Nast's illustrations, which come in the late 1800s, but Thomas Nast was using.
Yes.
Yeah, it's all a chain. It's all connected for sure.
Because before that, there wasn't really a unified idea of what figure came around house to house and gave you presents. Oh no. And you go to Europe nowadays, and when I lived in the Czech Republic, it's not brought by anything resembling Santa Claus. The presents are brought by Ježíšek, who is the invisible flying baby Jesus with an army of Roman soldiers to accompany him. Oh, I didn't know they did that. I didn't know they did that in Czech Republic. I know in Mexico, invisible flying baby Jesus brings things. Yeah.
Invisible flying baby Jesus, he gets around. People are like, well, how does Santa reach all these homes? It's like he outsources people. Like he has a whole.
See, now the Santa Claus cinematic universe, that is what I thought, genuinely speaking, that I was going to go into that horrible Disney Plus show, The Santa Clauses. That's what I thought they were doing. I thought we were going to get, especially when I saw Befana, I thought, oh, the final episode is going to be all of the various present delivering figures are coming together to save Christmas. And it's like, oh no, I've got this region and I've got this region and I'm American Santa, the American godsification of Santa Claus. And it wasn't that, and I was very mad, but I'm still waiting on that to be written.
That would make a lot more sense, and it would be a really interesting story.
So
Like
much
I know
more
that,
fun.
yeah, it would
Like
be
all of the various all the various present delivering figures,
right,
at a conclave.
right, and the Kinderschreck figures, the ones that the child scared, the boogeymen, right? Those child scaring figures that get rolled into this time of year too. So I mean, Krampus is the one that everybody knows. But there's bunches of them, and even our American Santa has a little bit of that left over, where if you're bad, you get coal and switches, right? You get that, which is part of like the merger that happened with him and what the figure known as the
Belschnickel,
yeah.
Which it only lives on in modern thought because of The Office.
Well, I argue differently, but no, The Office definitely has something to do with it for sure.
Listen, buddy, I don't think that I don't know. Dwight Schrute is very powerful. That's a very powerful figure.
No, the fact that everybody associates the Belschnickel with "Have you been impish or admirable" is testimony to the fact that the Office has a lot of sway over that. But I'm glad that it did it, and this is what folklore does: is little bits will come back up every once in a while. So
I like all of the monsters that eat people. Do you have a favorite? I will. The one, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina had a very memorable Christmas episode featuring Gryla, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name, and the Yule Lads, which I think they depicted as sort of like her adopted kids. And I don't think that's how that actually works in the myth, but
the other kind of poltergeists in the Sabrina episode, which is not entirely wrong. And it's not entirely wrong to say that they're her kids. It's a question of what do they mean by her kids? Are they her kids that she has adopted and collected over time, or are they her kids that she has given birth to? The
TV show version was, I think they were her adopted kids, like that she had stolen or something.
Right, and so that ties her into a whole phenomenon of what are called the Perchten, or the Frau Perchte characters, who she travels around with. I think they're called the Hemmelchen or Hemmetchen. They're the children, the unbaptized children, right? That die and their souls get collected up and pulled into sort of a wild hunt like thing with this woman Perchte, Berchte, depending on where you are, who sort of leads them. And Grilla is sometimes represented that way. Really, she's usually represented as kind of an ogre. The Hilda version of Grilla is. And this is the second time in as many days I've brought up the Hilda version of anything, because Hilda, if you haven't seen
Hilda's great.
Please go watch Hilda.
Hilda's great.
It's just one of the best folklore influenced shows. I know it's a cartoon, but please give it a chance. It's so good.
It's very good. So we love Hilda around here.
Yeah. And her version of the Yule Lads is pretty good too, because the Yule Lads are mischievous and problematic, and they cause chaos, but they're not evil until they sort of reveal what their purpose is. And that's a little more akin to what the Yule Lads can do. They're really there to mess things up. And you have names like, Spoon Licker and Candle Biter, and one's called Stubby, Shorty. There's one's called Sheep Botherer or Sheep Molester, kind of depending on how you interpret it. It's not what people think, but it's also not what people think. It's a whole thing. So it's they're there to kind of cause chaos and havoc, but the whole point is that you put up with them, you deal with them in the time leading up to Christmas, and you leave your shoes out on this windowsill, and you can get candy or nuts or things like that in your shoes for this. And then if you've put up with them and done well by them, then you don't have to worry about Grilla coming to your home. She's not going to do anything to you. So and Grilla, again, she's in the Sabrina episode, they present her as kind of a witch queen.
But everybody in the Sabrina verse had to be a witch.
And it was fine for the show, for the framework of the fiction. It's fine. The thing for me is I really hope people then watch it and go, oh, I want to know more about her, and dig in and see like, oh, that's not really the depiction of her that comes out of the folklore, which is fine. And again, you can play with this stuff all you want. It's just like people to be clear about what's actually pulled from the culture versus what's sort of overlaid by another culture as well. And make sure that the cultures that create these things have the authorship, their own authorship, because it's a collective community authorship that has to exist. But I like the lads in there. There's one character that didn't really get into in the Sabrina show, and I don't think they put her in. They didn't put her in Hilda either. But I really like is the Yola Katrin, which is the Yule Cat.
Oh yeah.
This is the Icelandic Yule Cat.
Yule Cat appeared in a few. Yule Cat actually appears in the Santa Chronicles. With Yule Cat appears in the Santa Chronicles. I know in the Santa Chronicles too, but might appear in the first one as well, which was actually a pretty decent Netflix, taking on kind of that live action Santa space. Did you watch that at all?
I have not. No.
Oh, okay. You might like the Santa Chronicles. The second one is a little cheesier and kind of loses its way in the final act, but it's an interesting, it's another interesting modern take on Santa. I like the version of the elves. The elves are tiny, vicious things. I love them. But yeah, it has the Yule Cat.
That's the kind of the same kind of elves that you get in like the movie Krampus as well, where they're kind of villainous horror creatures, which I love that too, although that's obviously also a little bit weird with the folklore. But the Yule Cat is great, and I love the Yule Cat. It is a child-eating monster from Iceland. Sometimes does get associated with Grýla. Sometimes they frame it as her pet. And it's this giant, it's an enormous, bigger than a house, a very large cat that will come through the night. And the thing I love about the Yule Cat is, for a lot of the like Kinderschreck figures, the ones that are there to scare the children, it has to do with like, are the children behaving well or not behaving well? And if they're not behaving well, the Yule Cat's not interested in that. The Yule Cat is interested in one thing only: did you get new clothes for Christmas, and are you wearing them? That's it. That's all it cares about. Did you get
the Yule Cat is the spirit of all mothers who did all of that shopping and bought you those Christmas PJs.
Yes. And did you wear them?
My God. Oh no.
That's it.
Christmas PJs are Yule Cat. No, wow. That just, okay.
That's it. That's all of it. That's the whole thing. And I love it. And if you're not wearing your new clothes, or if you didn't get new clothes, so it can come back to the parents, right? So if the parents failed in getting the new clothes, which you're supposed to get at Christmas, or if the kids aren't wearing it, then the Yule Cat's going to drag you out into the darkness and either eat you or take you back to Grýla or whatever it is. That's the thing. And I love it. I love that that's like, it's so
my
specific.
Mother has been protecting me since childhood against being eaten by a giant cat by giving me Christmas pajamas.
Every time you get underwear or socks, even if you get a belt, it's all of it. You put
I'm very happy.
You wear Ralphie's bunny suit when Aunt Petunia or whatever sends you the bunny suit, because otherwise the cat is going to eat you. And I love it. I
don't want the cat to eat me. I'd like to ask you some very silly questions and some very serious questions about a made-up wintertime figure that exists between a small group of friends, namely you and me and people that we know, that we lovingly and fearfully refer to as the Nog.
Fear the Nog.
Fear the Nog. Every winter, the story that we have come to understand, the lore that we have come to understand about the Nog after we discovered the Nog about a decade ago, is that the Nog travels house to house on the night of the winter solstice, ensuring that, like you said, some figures of this time period are very concerned with whether certain people have been nice, and some figures are here to punish those that have been naughty, and some people are here to make sure that you're wearing your Christmas pajamas. But there's one aspect of wintertime that the Nog is concerned with, and it is that, are you appropriately fearful? Because this time is not just a time of joy and gift giving and presents and hope. It's also a time of fear, because maybe the sun won't come back tomorrow. Maybe the sun will not rise. Maybe just a ball of floating gas will illuminate the world. And in order for that sun to rise, you must be appropriately fearful. So the Nog visits house to house, and you have to appease him with offerings of ketchup-covered marshmallows, which resemble the baby flesh. All of those things are things that we completely made up in the last 10 years. This is just a fun little story that we told ourselves, and is now a fake holiday called Nog's Watch that we celebrate every year on the night of the winter solstice, mostly because I will not let it die. But is that how these things start? Could the Nog become something?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it could. It'll have to pass beyond you. Somebody will have to carry on the tradition even after you
Cory,
stop.
I'm sorry. Are you telling me that you do not celebrate Nog's Watch in your home?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying,
because it
Sounds like you're telling me that you don't celebrate Nog's Watch in your home.
well, I live a constantly fearful life. I am I have no reason to celebrate Nogswatch any more than any other day of the year, because I am constantly afraid and have been since like 2016. But
so for things to go on and become a greater part of the culture, they have to go beyond tiny group of people. Right. Okay, so we've got a podcast. We've got hundreds of thousands of followers between the two of us on social media. So let's tell people about, so let's say, hypothetically, let's game this out, right? So I go on social media, I tell other people about the Nog. 100 people decide, oh, I like that. I'm going to do that.
Yes.
And then the next year, 100 more people, and then 500 more people. When does it eventually become a thing?
There's not a hard and fast rule. So I'm going to go outside of my sort of academic folklore side of this and talk to somebody that I really liked and respected a lot during his time on Earth was Peter Patton, who used to host the Crooked Path podcast, wrote a lot of interesting books on sort of witchcraft and stuff like that. But he had a good grasp on aspects of folklore too. And one of the points that he made was that something's not a tradition until it has passed 3 generations beyond its initial source. So it has to be transmitted 3 times independently of the original source transmitting it. So handed over 3 times. Now that doesn't mean 3 generations doesn't mean like 3 periods of 20 years, right? Like we're not going to have to, it doesn't have to, you're millennial. So it doesn't have to be like Gen Alpha, is participating in the Nogswatch, although that would be fine. But it has to be 3 separate iterations of people, the third of which doesn't even necessarily know it's from you. They don't necessarily even trace it back to you. They just do it because somebody in a previous generation told them. And that would be a pretty good indication that it has now taken its own route and has its own life and will continue on independently of any kind of input that you give it, right? At that point, it can become folklore. It can become something that people practice. Wolf and Newt did pretty well with
I was
that.
going to say, I mean, there are kind of a handful of things, a handful of traditions that have kind of just taken hold and do seem to have a life. Like what you brought up Wolf and Newt. Are there any others that you can think of?
So I mean, that's the first one. So I'm actually doing research on a bunch of sort of contemporary anti-holidays. So, for example, Galentine's Day or Anti-Valentine's Day both have very, very strong presences. They're not as strong as the dominant holiday, but they exert themselves in what scholar Sabrina Magliocco talks about, something called subdominance, which is you're not the dominant force in society, but you sort of act as though you are, or you act as though you have a legitimate right to a presence in that society, which you very well might. And so then you exert sort of the influence of your own culture, sort of in either pushing back against or sort of to circumvent the mainstream society. And
where does something like Pride or some of these like holidays that come or celebrations that come from modern groups of people that kind of take hold and end up going on, like where does that exist?
That's wonderful. Pride, I would say, we know its origins. Obviously, we can sort of point back to, right, the Stonewall riots, right? You can say the Stonewall riots are kind of a root source for a lot of the sort of pride. But interestingly, I would almost say, like, I don't want to call it pride mythology because that's not the right term, really.
No, but you said it, but I feel like there are certain legends, because where you said it, we tell it like it's true.
And there's truth to it. Yeah.
There is truth to it, but like,
but Marsha P. Jackson throwing that first brick, right?
Yes, Marsha P. Jackson's brick. I was trying to think of her last name.
You could so turn that into something folklorically iconic.
Even though she didn't pick up a brick.
Right. That's the thing, right? So
that's the legend. It's Marsha P. Jackson's brick.
Right. She pushes back against society. She exists 100%. She exists. She's there. There's absolutely, rioting and pushing back. And there are riots. There are bricks being thrown. But we've conflated some things, and we've got a new story based on that. But it's. I mean, have you seen The Life of Pi or read The Life of Pi?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Do you remember the whole thing about like, and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but he kind of asks, like, which is the better story? Well, so it goes with God, right?
Yeah.
What's the better story? The better story is Marsha P. Jackson picking up a brick and hurling it, even though it's not historically accurate. it's the story that kind of gives us that surge of like, yes. And then we can parse out the history from it. And it's really important to do that, but to also understand that the story that we're telling has some validity too, right? There's a reason
Sometimes
we
when
want to tell it that way.
sometimes when I talk about just kind of the concept of belief in magic, belief in lore, belief in certain traditions and things, I tell people that that's just the version of the world that I would like to exist in. I would like to exist in a world with magic. I would like to exist in a world with fairies and gods and river monsters and things like that. I would much rather live in that world because the other world sucks. And there's a piece of that I'm consciously buying it. Yes, 100%. But the thing is, I think that they overlay on one another.
Yes.
I think that we can tell ourselves stories about the mundane world using the more fantastical world, and it doesn't have to be untrue. It's just there's just a conscious sort of buy-in and a recognizing that one of these is not literally how it happened, but it doesn't mean it can't still tell me a truth.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's been some people who really tap into that beautifully. Hayao Miyazaki, who you mentioned earlier, My Neighbor Totoro, does a marvelous job of looking at like, well, the practical thing when you move into a new house, you got to clean it, right? Got to get rid of those soot sprites, right? Both things are fine. You can have soot sprites that you're cleaning out and getting rid of.
Of course, the much greater story of how do small children cope with
the mother being sick. Oh, I can't talk about it. I'm going to cry.
Yeah, but how do small children cope with big stuff like my parent has a chronic illness that she may not recover from, or he was able to very beautifully do something similar in The Secret World of Arietti, where he took the story of the borrowers and added an interesting sort of twist where the boy who lives in the house is actually very sick. He kind of goes through this. Miyazaki tends to tell tales of kind of ennui a bit, this pastoral ennui, and he does a lot of slice of life things. Guillermo del Toro is another voice in there, like his new Pinocchio take does something very similar. And it's sort of Pinocchio by way of Grave of the Fireflies.
Yeah, I'm interested. I wasn't interested in that because I'll be honest. I struggle.
You haven't
with
seen
Del Toro. No, because I struggle with Del Toro. He showed Pan's Labyrinth in one of my classes, but I should be honest. I hate Pan's Labyrinth. I hate it because of the ending and because of certain things that I sort of feel I come out of it with. That being said, I show it to classes because I have deep respect for him. I have deep respect for what he's doing. I think he's very good. He's a very good director, visually very brilliant, very innovative and very thoughtful. But I would have rather you called me a slur, is all I'm saying. I would rather you called me a slur. Let's say I don't like Pan's Labyrinth.
Pan's Labyrinth?
I don't. It makes
I would like to hear I would like to hear how you arrived at this incorrect opinion. What don't you like about Pan's Labyrinth?
It's just the interpretation at the end. I'm left with a nihilistic interpretation, and it has to do with the way he told the story to get us there, and that nihilistic interpretation.
You think that the end is her brain firing off a more pleasant story as she goes to her final rest, and that is not real.
And the thing is, I can recognize that's not the only take on it, but the way that it is shot and the way that we get the story, that's what I'm left with. I think the way that I view that ending is basically depending on what I've eaten that day. Did I sleep well the night before? What frame of mind am I in? Yeah. And then I watch the movie and it changes the ending each time. And I think that's wonderful. And if people can come to it with that, I think that's a really wonderful thing about what he can do is he can present.
I don't understand how you can love Totoro and hate Pan's Labyrinth because they do the same thing.
Because Totoro isn't nihilistic. It just doesn't have any.
Because Totoro doesn't kill the kids.
Well, and so I watched Grave of the Fireflies was the double feature with Totoro, right? And Grave of the Fireflies is very nihilistic. And weirdly, like I can watch Grave of the Fireflies and I'm like, I don't ever want to watch it again, but I'm glad I watched it. I have that same opinion of Labyrinth, where I'm like, I don't really want to watch it again. I'm glad I watched it because I respect the hell out of what he did. I just, it's just a story that leaves me feeling nihilism is the one thing that like really takes a lot out of me, and it drains me a lot. Like if I can have a little bit of hope, it's okay. And just the way that movie ends, it doesn't leave me with that. So That's just me. That's just me. I'm not saying anybody else has to.
It is literally
that
just you, Cory
yeah,
Hutcheson. Literally just you.
That's totally fine.
Sending
But yeah,
after you.
those are some folks that really do great work with adding magic into a world that can feel as though the magic has been stolen away from it in some way. And but without necessarily asking you to forgo your rationality or forgo the gritty realness of the world at times too. That's one of the things in Pan's Labyrinth I think is really powerful, is that it's all happening against the Franco regime and the oppression, the repression and the fascism that's going on there. It's brutal. It's brutal, and the stuff that she has to do is heartbreaking. And yet magical. So I think that's a really wonderful.
And yet you're also screaming at the screen like, could you really not have waited to eat that freaking grape? Could you not have waited?
Sure. But she can't. And like that, mythologically, I get it. She can't.
I know.
The whole
every other kid and every other story and every other magical garden. And it's almost like instructions. This scene has been in a million other stories. And every single time they eat the freaking food. And I'm like, could you just not wait?
But they have to do it. That's how the quest works, is how the journey works. So
this episode is going to be coming out right after Christmas and before New Year's. Do you have a couple of favorite New Year's traditions? I know there's black-eyed in the South. We do the black-eyed peas and cabbage. You would do my husband's family will throw coins out the front door and sweep them back in. We also, right at midnight, fill a glass of usually champagne with like 12 grapes, and you
12
make
grapes,
a wish with each one.
For each month, right? You get one good month for each grape.
Yep. So do you have any favorites?
The foodways are always really wonderful. I love the black-eyed peas is one I've done, and my family is not a fan of black-eyed peas, so we've resorted to making something called cowboy caviar, which is not the same as the other kind of cowboy caviar.
That's not
it's black-eyed peas.
That's a 7-layer dip.
It is a 7-layer dip, but it has the black-eyed peas in it, so you can do that. And I I personally like the Hop and John version of black-eyed peas. I think that's the better version, where it's the kind of stewed black-eyed peas and things like that. And I like to have collard greens with that, but just hard to get them. And then Pennsylvania German practices are pork and kraut. So I like to throw cabbage into the mix if I can do that.
That sounds good.
Yeah, honestly, a really good way to do that is to have egg rolls, because you get cabbage and pork in an egg roll, which is a nice way to do it. So
I like that.
Yeah,
I love that.
It's fun. And then cleaning is a big one. I always try to clean my house out right before the
and wear new clothes on New Year's Day.
And then
the cat will come back.
Yeah, the Yule cat. He's still wandering around. He's still lurking.
Oh, there is still one figure that exists after all of this, and it's Befana, La Befana, that comes on January 6th on the night of Epiphany.
Not just one. There's so many. Like that's the other weird thing, is people sort of think of Christmas as like the one day.
I know.
It's a whole season. So you have the Magi on Epiphany. The Krampus Krampus really shows up in the first part of the month, but you have a lot of these figures that can show up anytime up to the Epiphany. The Epiphany is
I'm looking through my house in like March and just open the supply closet, and it's like there's just some little imp there, and it's like, I'm sorry I was late, but I have to hit you with these sticks or something.
Yeah,
they just show up, they just keep coming, and it's like, can't we be done at some point?
No. And then and you're going to go from that into Lent, right? You're going to earn into the pre-Lenten carnival season. So there's stuff that can cross over into that space too. And then you've got your Lenten season is really where you have your final break, where you can actually not have to worry about something wandering out of the woods demanding something of you, and all that. So
Dr. Cory Hutcheson, it is the privilege of a lifetime to know you, and I am so glad that we got to spend this time together. If folks who have never heard of you before, for whatever strange reason that I cannot possibly fathom, would like to get more of you, where can they do that?
Several places. The best place to find me is newworldwitchery.com/find-me, or I'm sorry, find-us, or just newworldwitchery.com. It's easy to find us there as well. That's our podcast for 200 articles on folk magic in North America. I'd also like to just really quickly plug, I've got 2 other shows as well. So if you're interested in folklore more generally intersecting with things like science or nature or history, I've got a show called Chasing Foxfire.
Is it back?
It's not back yet. It's one of those ones that I can only
I did check this morning.
No, I produce a season at a time.
Oh, okay.
And I have a plan for the whole next season. I just haven't gotten around to it yet.
I love that show.
Thank you. I enjoy it too. It's a lot of fun. And then we also do, my co-host Lane and I do a show called Myth Taken, a Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcast, where we look at each episode of Buffy, but we also talk about the folklore in Buffy the Vampire Slayer as well. So any of those, would love to have folks check those out. Got a couple of books coming out in 2020. Actually, got 3 books coming out in 2023. I don't know. Got one called Llewellyn's Complete Book of North American Folk Magic, which will be coming out in like March. Elaine and I wrote a book together, which is called Conjuring the Commonplace, Guide to Everyday Enchantment and Junk Drawer Magic, which is all about the folklore about all the objects that are in your house, like everyday, like, spoons and teacups and dish towels and stuff like that. There's folklore about them, and you can find sort of the enchantment and magic in them. And then I'm going to be doing a 10th anniversary edition of my book on folklore of playing cards. That'll be out in the end of the year.
52 Devils.
54 Devils, but yes.
54. And of course you did write, you and I had the very special experience of having books come out during the Panchetta. You wrote a brilliant book that is also the same name of your podcast, New World Witchery.
Yes.
Which is fantastic.
Thanks. I hope people like it. I don't know. So
it is a fantastic way to keep this particular table level when I need to do interviews. So it's holding this table up right now. It's great. It's good. I love it.
I literally have it holding up my computer right now. So there you go.
It's an excellent weapon.
Making me level, so I'm not talking to you from down here. So.
If somebody ever breaks into my house, I keep it by my bedside.
It's useful. Very, yes. For beating things.
Very girthy. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. Happy
Thanks
holidays
for having
to you
me.
And yours.
It's delightful.